Good morning. I'm Mackenzie Babb, External Affairs Director for the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise at UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. So happy to welcome you here today. This marks the 8th in our series of briefings on the economic and business impact of COVID-19, and today's conversation will explore the very uneven impact that the pandemic has had on different types of workers and different types of organizations. I'm going to hand things over to our panelists here in just a moment, but before we kick things off, I'll walk you through how today's conversation will go. Each of our panelists is going to have a few minutes to introduce themselves and share a few thoughts and insights from their own individual areas of research expertise during the first half of the call. Right around 11:30, we're going to move into Q&A. We'll respond to your questions. So reporters joining us via webinar, you are welcome to submit those questions anytime using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. For reporters who are joining us by phone, you are welcome to submit your questions via email to me. I think you've heard from me plenty, but just as a reminder, my email is mackenzie_babb@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. With that, it is my pleasure to kick things off by handing the mic over to UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School Professor Matt Pearsall. Matt?
I'm Matt Pearsall, a professor of organizational behavior at the Kenan-Flagler Business School. I study leadership, stress, and team adaptation. Obviously, a lot of people are still working in warehouses and plants, factories and supermarkets with all the associated risks and difficulties. There are a lot of challenges for leaders in those situations that are worth talking about. Today, however, I'll be focusing primarily on knowledge workers, connected only by technology. I'll briefly address some of the challenges and best practices for leading and managing people and teams working from home. It's important to frame this discussion to think about these issues within the larger environment of anxiety and uncertainty about the virus, as well as the growing concerns about potential furloughs and layoffs for workers. Few organizations can make promises to their workers about what the future will hold for them, and leaders are left with the unenviable task of figuring out how to balance getting the job done right now with helping ensure they still have a healthy and engaged workforce in the future. The most immediate concern for many folks is the feeling of being disconnected. Even in the best of times, research has consistently shown that teleworkers tend to feel isolated from their coworkers, detached from their projects. And now managers are having to go to much greater lengths to keep everyone in the loop, feel included. The most common approach right now has been the adoption of weekly or even daily department check-in meetings online, as well as frequent smaller group meetings. That's a helpful first step, but there are a few things to think about. First, one of the greatest benefits of face-to-face interactions at work are the social connections and seemingly non-productive that helps bind and group together. It's easy to try to be time efficient and keep meetings short, especially when people are feeling overwhelmed. But it's often the few minutes of unstructured discussion at the beginning or end of meetings that help keep people feel connected to the group and the organization. Second, in virtual meetings, it's critical that managers ensure that all viewpoints are being heard. The tendency for dominant personalities to take over in face-to-face meetings is exacerbated in virtual settings. It's even easier for important ideas to go unvoiced, especially when they would be coming from less extroverted or lower status members. The leader's job is to ensure the discussion process is effective, and often that means doing less talking themselves while focusing on guiding the group discussion process to make sure junior and less heard voices are available to everyone and that everyone feels involved. It's also important to remember that everyone's having a different experience. Be careful of non-complainers, people that always say they're fine. Some people may be, but others may, either through personality or fear, fail to ask for help. If you see the performance or demeanor change over the weeks, be ready to follow up. Organizations also can't rely solely on managers to provide social support. Many workers may feel uncomfortable going to their boss when they're struggling. Some organizations have focused on keeping the mentor relationship alive during this time, giving people an outside connection to go to talk through work problems or just vent. It may be beneficial to have people in your organization to lean on who are respected, but not the mentee's direct boss, who can keep an extra eye out on people who are struggling. All that said, we also have to be careful not to create needless meetings to overburden people who are struggling with balancing home and work demands, especially with children and other family at home. One key thing to keep in mind during this is the balance between short and long-term thinking. We still have day-to-day responsibilities that have to be met. Leaders are under a lot of pressure as it's a critical time for many businesses. Managers have to overcome the tendency to focus on the short term and the desire to oversee every aspect of work. More than ever, flexible work schedules and results-driven feedback are important. For example, performance goals and evaluations need to be carefully constrained and considered. This may not be the best time to emphasize goal attainment or to try to motivate their competition. Such efforts may be more likely to create withdrawal and feelings of hopelessness than engagement for many. Instead, focus on helping employees figure out effective and lasting processes that will help them stay productive over time. Specifically, it's important to work with them to develop self-evaluations of their own processes and performance, formal or informal after-action reviews, for example. What have they done well? What have they done poorly? What can they do to improve their ability to perform and cope? Most importantly, what do they need from you to be successful? What kind of support has been lacking or has been really effective? This is a time for figuring things out. Many workers will need help and guidance. Finally, many organizations are emphasizing transparency about what is happening, what's planned, where the risks and problems are. The natural tendency is to want to shield our people from additional worries, but that's usually a mistake. A lack of information leaves a vacuum. We tend to fill it with the worst case scenarios anyway, and it's very hard to be productive waiting for the other shoe to drop. Trust in management is built through transparency, communication, and consistency. Even no news communication updates give us a sense of being in the loop and a limited feeling of control. Professor Shimul Melwani will now talk more about employee feelings of anxiety and frustration during this time.
My name is Shimul Melwani, and I'm an associate professor of organizational behavior here at Kenan-Flagler. My research is on the role of emotions and interpersonal interactions at work, and I'm going to focus on these two areas in my briefing today. One of the things I've struggled with as an emotion scholar at a business school is that sometimes the business case for experiences like emotions isn't exactly obvious, especially in the face of hard numbers, which we know are always seen as more compelling. But as we think about what's happening around us right now, everything is pointing to the importance of understanding and managing our emotions right now. Because emotions are a shared human experience, they have an evolutionary basis, and we all tend to react to events in the same or similar ways. Emotions are really the experience that are binding us all right now. Employees everywhere are struggling with anxiety and with loneliness. Leaders and organizations are realizing the need to finally turn their direction inward instead of outward to manage their employees' toxic emotions. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about how our emotions during the pandemic affect us and the organizations to which we belong. In talking about this, I will specifically highlight three populations who are experiencing and having to cope with emotions in entirely new ways. And I would argue that unless leaders, organizations, and policymakers start to understand the effects of employee emotions, the damage caused by COVID-19 will extend beyond its immediate health concerns to one that has aversive implications for individual productivity, creativity, well-being, and even organizational success. To ignore emotions now would be a resounding mistake. When talking about employees or people's emotions, the most relevant phenomenon that I'd like to talk about really is emotional contagion. Emotional contagion is the literal catching of emotions. Emotions, like viruses, spread from one person to another. And what's fascinating about this particular phenomenon is that it happens most often at a subconscious level. Emotions spread completely automatically, in person, through online interaction, through social media. And in some of my work, I've even found that emotions can be caught even when we are listening to someone cry or laugh in another room. One of the most insidious aspects of emotional contagion is that we don't even know when we are experiencing it. And while this can be a good thing, emotional contagion can often lead teams or leader-follower dyads to start to experience more similar emotions, and these similar emotions can lead them to feel more connected, to feel more engaged, and to then cooperate with one another. What is happening right now, this contagion of negative emotions, is actually likely to reduce or worsen people's ultimate outcomes. Essentially, what we know from research is that when we are feeling negative, we are more likely to see the world with that negative filter. Right now, we're already anxious. We're anxious about our health, about the health of our family, our finances, our jobs, and our communities. And so we become even more sensitive and more likely to become influenced by everyone else's justifiable fear. Through the process of transferring emotions, it's easy to become infected by the negative emotions of our coworkers on Zoom, the TV show hosts that we're listening to, our moms, the people we follow on Twitter, and so on. In effect, we catch other people's anxiety, and then we start to transfer it to others who relay it back to us in this unending spiral of negative emotions. And all these effects are only made worse when we are under stress or experiencing lack of control, as has been the case through the entire COVID-19 pandemic. In many ways, the surge of emotional contagion of anxiety was really the reason or the culprit that explained the widespread panic that led to toilet paper hoarding or the stock market crash in mid-March. And because emotions are a filter through which we see the world, This fever pitch of anxiety led to questionable decision-making, withdrawal from others, and inability to listen and engage in dialogue, and in many cases, as we saw from leaders, paralysis or vacillation. And while we've become a little more sensitized to this anxiety, there's only so long we can kind of continue at a very high level or intense level of it. I'd actually like to think forward about the emotions we might be experiencing going into the next couple of months of likely being at home. Anxiety, being the sort of the widespread emotion that we felt in March or April, is now starting to subside, and many other negative emotions are taking its place. We're frustrated because we don't actually know when we're going to be able to return to our normal lives. We're angry because we might not be happy with the way our governments are handling these changes. We're lonely because Zoom happy hours don't feel like the real thing anymore. And most of all, as I found in some of my own work, we're feeling really bored as the things we can be doing with our day are completely drying up. In my own work, I've actually found that momentary experiences of boredom or anger can actually have long-lasting effects. Feeling bored early in the day is likely to link to feeling bored later in the day, and it's likely to sort of reduce our productivity and our effort. And so the question now becomes, what happens if we are starting to enter these unending spirals of boredom with a side of anger? The question for organizations, leaders, and individuals themselves is, how are we going to manage this? I would argue that the emotional contagion of boredom and its far-reaching negative effects is really going to amplify the damage caused by COVID as individuals start to withdraw even more from their work. And relatedly, while social connection can lead to this negative emotional contagion, the flip side of this is also important to talk about. The lack of real social connection is one of the reasons that we are now feeling so susceptible to negative contagion. So much of our conversation in the news has been, rightly so, on the importance of maintaining our relationships. Managers should continue to talk to their employees, team members should continue to do their group chats, all to sort of maintain these strong connections that existed prior to us all sort of becoming hermits in our own home. While I'm all about that, it's also really critical for individuals at work to start thinking about the missing or unexpected interactions. In traditional work settings, we know where to find our people. We know who to grab coffee with. We know who we're going to go get a drink with after work. The positive emotions from these social encounters often provide the juice for us to become more creative or provide energy to engage more deeply in our work. But unfortunately, these planned and structured online meetings that require us to mute ourselves and prevent us from sort of acting in sort of more spontaneous ways have completely sort of reduced the ease and delight of our casual encounters that often keep us going through our workday. We're missing the positive emotions that spark from these interactions. Instead, we're learning to work better in our silos, putting our heads down, managing to accomplish our tasks, but really preventing us from engaging in open brainstorming, voice, and creative work, or even just simply seeing that someone needs help and being able to help them. How we can start to manage and recreate these types of accidental and unexpected positive interactions is a question that all of us should be grappling with right now. And then the lack of positive emotions and exacerbated negative emotions are especially detrimental for three populations. At the top of this population list are at-risk populations, frontline workers in particular, who are experiencing these toxic emotions at unimaginable levels. From the anxiety of worrying about contracting the virus if you are a delivery worker or a grocery store employee, to the exposure to traumatic events as a healthcare worker, are all leading to extremely negative emotional responses. And the suicides of the two New York healthcare workers really highlight the risks of not being able to manage many of these toxic emotions. In addition, the populations that are at risk are sadly always the populations who are at risk. They're the marginalized and the vulnerable. There was some research that found that after Hurricane Katrina, for example, race and socioeconomic factors played a role in shaping depression and suicide risk. This is an issue that's largely in sort of the lap of policymakers who will need to design accessible programs to help manage the literal trauma experienced by many of these groups. I read that the demand for mental health services almost exactly matches the geographic march of the virus across the US. And so as a society, we need to be thinking about plans for managing these thus far unmanaged negative emotions. The second group that I'd like to sort of talk to is one that's near and dear to me. We have been reading a lot about working parents who have been struggling at home. People subject to quarantine or self-isolation are at risk for confusion and anger and emotional tendencies that can be explosive when many household members are simultaneously enduring these for many months at a time. I've been conducting my own research into the emotional experiences of parenting during quarantine, and my work finds exactly this. Parents are, in a single word, not okay. They are more burned out, working longer hours, multitasking often close to 6 hours a day. And while women are bearing the brunt of much of this, for the first time, men and women's reactions to being home is equivalent. Fathers and mothers are equivalently anxious, angry, frustrated, and exhausted. By the same token, they are equivalently hopeful, grateful, and content. One of the major things we noticed in this very early stage data is that the big difference was the extent to which parents were noticing and accepting the full range of their emotions. Parents who experienced and recognized their mixed emotions were more likely to be renegotiating family responsibilities, but also their job responsibilities. They were more likely to be crafting more sustainable schedules, altering their future goals, and even managing their current ones. We know that major stressors alter the trajectory of our intimate relationships and our interactions outside of them. And we really need to be doing more work to unpack when and why and for whom these effects are most harmful. Last, I'd like to talk about the role of leaders. In some way, leaders bear the greatest onus right now. Leaders, by virtue of their authority, exert a disproportionate impact on the mood of those they supervise. Those operating with anxiety are likely to spread negativity faster. By the same token, false cheer is likely to ring untrue at such a time, and a lack of authenticity may prove to be even worse. While much research says that empathy is the primary emotion that leaders should be operating with right now, and I would agree, I would also say that just like the parents I described earlier, leaders that are going to thrive right now are those who are recognizing and displaying their mixed emotions. This emotional complexity will allow them to be more attuned to divergent perspectives in their teams, open to new ideas, and will allow them to be more flexible in their thinking. These mixed emotions will also enable them to tell the most hopeful and empowering stories in any situation, but also be willing to confront the difficult facts that are arising and deal with them directly. Followers with leaders who are authentically expressing their feelings of paradox are more likely to feel comfortable about displaying their own vulnerability and having more authentic interactions. In sum, remember that none of us are emotional islands. We all need to recognize and manage our own and others' emotions, irrespective of the role we are in, leaders, policymakers, or even individuals. While leaders and policymakers really need to ensure now that the micro and macro changes are being made to ensure that employees' emotions are managed successfully, individuals need to start focusing inward, have compassion for themselves, accept the full range of the emotions that they are feeling, and utilize them accurately when they are engaging in interactions, both now, during our times, during the pandemic, and even after. I'd like to now turn the conversation over to my talented co-author, Angelica Leigh.
Perfect. I'm going to keep going. So based on demographic data released by 25 states and DC, we know that African Americans so far account for about 34% of the COVID deaths in the U.S., even though they are only 13% of the population. Furthermore, we know that people of color are more likely to be employed in essential services like nurses and grocery store cashiers and bus drivers, making them more susceptible to contracting the virus. And we also know that African Americans are more likely to have the chronic conditions like asthma, diabetes, or high blood pressure that increases the likelihood of fatality due to COVID-19. In another vein, we also know that Asian Americans are dealing with additional stress and threat due to the pandemic. As people continue to refer to the coronavirus as the Chinese virus, there have been reports that Asians are coping with an uptick in discrimination and hate crimes. And even before it was recommended that we wear masks and social distance from each other, Asian Americans were feeling ostracized as people avoided them in public or covered their faces. Now, if you think back to this Zoom call or this conference call that you're on with your work colleagues and we're all checking in with each other, based on this data that I just reviewed, we know that people may be having very different experiences related to this pandemic. And yet, in professional work settings, employees are not likely to bring up and discuss a lot of these topics with each other because it'll highlight and be a spotlight on our differences that we have between each other. In my research, I find that societal events can have impacts on people depending on their social identities, and I refer to these societal events that are interpreted and experienced differently, particularly by minorities, as megathreats. And I've studied numerous megathreats, such as the shooting of a Black woman named Tatiana in Fort Worth, Texas, by police officers, and the U.S. president tweeting that members of the House of Representatives should go back to the crime-infested countries from which they came. And what I find is that these events are important occurrences, not just for the people who are directly involved in these events, but for also people who share these social identities with victims in these events, because they lead to highlighting the increased risk of discrimination and harm that often accompanies group memberships. I also find that once individuals enter diverse workplaces, that they continue to cope with the difficulties and the stress and the threat related to megathreats. But unlike a societal event, which may be experienced similarly by all of us, like a hurricane that strikes a local community, megathreats are interpreted and experienced differently based on your social group membership. And this makes them taboo topics or hard to really cope with within diverse work settings. And in reading about the pandemic and thinking about the experience and the disparate impact that it's having on minorities, it seems that there are aspects of this pandemic that really mirror these other megathreats that I've studied in my work. So how can individuals and organizations really deal with the fact that their employees may be having vastly different experiences related to the pandemic? I think first it's important for employees, harkening back to both Matt and Shimul, to find people who they can be socially connected with and share their authentic experiences with. For racial minorities, we know based on research about connections that this may be harder for racial minorities to do, but in organizations that have established networks like employee resource groups, this might be a great way for racial minority employees to be able to reach out to others who will be able to relate to their experiences. In another vein, just being able to authentically connect with people with which you have already shared an authentic bond with may help racial minorities continue to cope with their experiences related to the event. And I think in general, for managers, it's important to realize that while we all might be in this together, some of us are really coping with exponentially more anxiety and stress and threat related to this pandemic. To truly build an inclusive climate and make sure that everyone is socially connected, it means that it can't be just safe to be able to talk about the impact that this pandemic is having on your family or your extended community. To really truly be inclusive, it may also need to be important to be able to share with your coworkers your lived experiences dealing with the pandemic. Like the fact that for some minorities, they're wondering whether they should actually wear masks when they go to the grocery store. While the mask may prevent them from contracting the virus, it may also lead to increased bias and discrimination. And I know that it might be challenging to create this type of inclusive and open culture in a virtual setting, but I think that really openly acknowledging that we're not all experiencing this the same can be a really great start for fostering a sense of belonging that many employees may really need right now to focus and maintain any sense of productivity during this pandemic. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Alison Fragale.
Thanks, Angelica. So I'm Professor Alison Fragale, and like my colleagues, I'm an organizational psychologist at UNC. My areas of expertise are negotiation, power, and influence. And today I'm going to be talking about science and strategies for negotiating during these times. So negotiations are part of everyday human interaction. That is no less true, even when we are physically distancing. And some negotiations are formal, like signing a contract, whereas other negotiations are informal, like negotiations that happen between coworkers about what decisions get made, what work gets done, who's responsible for that work. And some of the workplace negotiations that are happening now are a direct or indirect result of COVID-19. So for example, trying to retain business when your customers no longer see your business as a priority for them right now. Or the opposite, extreme growth of your business because demand for your offerings has skyrocketed due to the pandemic. dealing with customers who want refunds for goods or services, asking employees to do more or different work than is normally part of their job description, and even employees who are loving their remote work setup and want to negotiate to keep it even when offices reopen. So all the science I'll cover is best practice in general. It's not specific to COVID-19, but I'll highlight 6 research-based strategies that negotiators need to utilize during these times. First one is manage anxiety. So Shimul talked about anxiety, but we also know that anxious negotiators do not perform well. When people are anxious, they try to exit the situation as soon as possible. And in negotiation, that means people make less ambitious offers, they concede more rapidly, they accept worse deals. But importantly, even incidental anxiety, which is anxiety that has nothing to do with the negotiation itself, also harms negotiation performance. So for example, in one study, they found that negotiators who listened to the shower scene music from Psycho, like before negotiating, actually performed worse than negotiators who listened to classical music. So managing our own anxiety and the anxiety of our employees during this time isn't just necessary for mental and physical health. It's also critical for achieving good deals and for managing the bottom line. The other thing we know is that we need to stay aspirational and data-driven. So negotiation success is as much about mindset as it is about strategy. So in one study, it was shown that negotiators who mentally focused on their aspiration point, which is their ideal outcome, in a negotiation performed 20% better than negotiators who didn't have an aspirational mindset. Presently, I'm seeing many experienced negotiators talking themselves out of an aspirational mindset. They say, oh, they won't be able to afford that. They don't have to agree to that. Desperation kills aspirations. So negotiators need to stay aspirational, but good aspirations are always based on data, not just dreams. And so if you find yourself in a new negotiation situation due to COVID-19, it's more important than ever to be collecting data to inform your aspiration. And one's personal network is a great source of data. So if you're dealing with it, you can guarantee that someone else in your network has just dealt or is dealing with the exact same problem right now. Third strategy is to manage the COVID-19 chatter. You might actually be getting quite tired of COVID-19 small talk, but it actually serves a strategic purpose. So when we start our meetings or our negotiations with that, those COVID-19 conversations, how are you holding up? Everyone healthy? How you survive in the homeschooling? One consequence of COVID-19 is that we do all have something in common right now. And that is to our advantage, as highlighting similarities between people does build trust, liking, and rapport. So if we look across all of social psychology, all of the evidence supports that birds of a feather flock together. Opposites attract has very little empirical support. And so recognize that small talk around COVID-19 that people are doing is actually strategic and advantageous for building relationships. The fourth strategy is don't assume. Ask, listen, validate. Assumptions kill deals. So we always assume we know the other side more than they do, right? What they want, what they'll agree to. And these assumptions are deal killers because we develop negotiation strategies as if they are true when they aren't. So COVID-19 has caused our assumptions to run rampant. When will schools and businesses reopen? What will the economic fallout be? Our brains are assuming all day long. We need to be very careful not to let these assumptions spill over into our negotiation behavior. The solution is to turn every assumption in your head into a question. We know that the best negotiators ask twice as many questions as the average negotiator. And so negotiators should be asking questions about what their counterpart wants, why they want it, and of all the things they want, what's most important, what's a priority. Asking questions also allows you to validate the other person's perspective. So if you're negotiating with someone who tells you that their business is struggling, you should validate that. I hear where you're coming from. A good solution for you is one that reduces your expenditures in the next quarter. Validating another's perspective doesn't commit you to agreeing to anything, but it does go a long way to building your reputation as a trustworthy counterpart in their eyes. This is a moment for humanity, so don't be afraid to show the other side that you see their perspective. It will not weaken you. It will actually be to your advantage. Fifth piece of advice is to consider the power relationship in the long term. Being in the more powerful position in a negotiation is an advantage, but power dynamics often shift over time. So right now, I'm seeing many businesses refuse to give refunds or for services they can't provide due to stay-at-home orders. And in the short term, these businesses have a lot of power over their customers since they're holding the customer's money. Longer term, however, customers have a great deal of power over these businesses, choosing who to patronize in the future and influencing others in their networks. And so negotiators should consider the long-term power dynamics and then choose today's strategies accordingly. And then my final piece of advice is to highlight what you bring to the table. The question on every negotiator's mind is, what's in it for me? And the better you answer this question for your audience, the more likely they are to agree to what you want. So you need to either frame your argument to highlight the benefit to the other person or offer something in trade that makes the other person better off. If you want to negotiate to continue working from home, for example, then demonstrate how this will make your employer better off. If you want or need your employees to take on additional work responsibilities, then what's the exchange? What lower priority work can you take off their plate, or what resources can you provide to facilitate the completion of the additional work? So in sum, to successfully negotiate in the era of COVID-19, individuals and organizations need to focus on doing 6 things: managing the anxiety, their own and others, setting high aspirations, building the similarity, not assuming and instead asking questions, considering the long-term power dynamics, and highlighting the contributions to the relationship. Thank you. And Mackenzie, I guess I'm going to hand it back to you for Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much to Allison and to all of our panelists for sharing those insights and thoughts. I know we had a bit of trouble with some of the audio, so for folks joining us, you may have had some pixelated audio. I apologize for that. If you would like any clarifications, the Q&A period is a great time to ask for those. You are welcome to submit your questions, again, using the Q&A function right here in Zoom, or you're welcome to email them to me at mackenzie_babb@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. Our first question today comes from a researcher who has joined us. Came in via email, and this one is for you, Angelica. Angelica, many of the factors that play into the disparities for African Americans and other minorities during the crisis are standing. After the pandemic is over, what do you see as the major changes that need to be made to prevent these disparities in the event of another pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, for many people that know about these disparities, researched these disparities, or have lived these disparities, it hasn't really been a surprise of how this pandemic has impacted vulnerable communities. If you had asked me a year ago whether there was going to be, if there was going to be a global health pandemic in which, chronic conditions were going to make people more likely to die from this virus, or, access to healthcare were important things to consider in terms of contracting the virus and surviving from it, I would have told you, and I'm sure other, actual health experts would have told you that this was going to be a problem for more vulnerable communities. I think in thinking about long-term, the changes that have to be made, I think that the question of policies that need to be in place and the impact that may have on communities are probably going to be debated in the public sphere and our government and in our healthcare system for years to come. I've heard a lot of people say that, while this pandemic is tragic and it might be the thing that gets us, to work and to collectively want to do better. And I hope that happens. And thinking about employees and organizations, this pandemic might be the source of getting us to actually be more likely to connect and develop these kind of relationships, deeper relationships in which we're comfortable talking about our differences more. And that is my hope for the future. My hope for the future is that, as these disparities are coming up, as, you have conversations with your work colleagues about the impact that this pandemic is maybe having on them or their families, or, the anxiety that they're feeling through reading about the disparate impact that this pandemic is having on their communities, as we hopefully start to have these conversations more with our work colleagues, that we're able to develop more of an understanding of each other and deeper relationships that we can maybe use as we return maybe to whatever the normal will become after this pandemic.
Great. Thank you so much, Angelica. Great answer. Our next question is for Alison, also from a researcher that's been submitted via email. The best negotiators are adept at reading body language and facial expressions, which is hard to do on a conference call or even online. Because of this, do these new forms of negotiation provide either disadvantages for the best negotiators or advantages for those who are not natural negotiators?
I think it could be a little bit of either. I think you have to do it differently. So if you don't have face-to-face available, you're generally left with three choices: email, phone, and something like this Zoom or a similar platform. One is you should choose your medium strategically. Generally speaking, you should not be engaging in email negotiations unless you're either sure that your audience loves you or your audience hates you. And at those extremes, email is okay. Anywhere in the middle, which is where most of us sit, then a synchronous platform is going to be better. Being able to be seen is better generally than just being able to be heard, because you do have the nonverbals, but some nonverbals aren't as clear even in Zoom. So for example, like I'm working with two monitors, so when I turn, am I ignoring you or am I actually looking at the thing you just sent me? That's obvious in face-to-face. It's not obvious here. So what I encourage people to do is, one, negotiate with the highest context medium you can. So I would prioritize Zoom for negotiations. If you have virtual meeting overload, then kick some of the other lower priority work to your email or phone and save this for your sort of high stakes collaboration. But you have to use your words to also signal the things that you could normally signal with your nonverbal. So my eye contact isn't as obvious to pick up. So for example, I can take notes to show you that I'm listening, but when I look down, you don't know if I'm looking at my phone. So to use your words, right? Let me take some notes here and to actually use your words to signal what you're doing. Back to, can it be an advantage? It can be using this kind of platform. I can have my data here. I can have all of my talking points, right? If I get anxious and I'm nervous about how I'm going to manage a conversation, if we're face to face, I can't be looking at my script, but I could be if I'm here. And so I think you want to use the virtual platform as much as you can, and then make sure you're using words to signal your intent, and then setting up your space to give you an advantage for anything that might help you be the best negotiator you could be that you wouldn't be able to do if you were face to face.
Great. Thank you so much, Alison. I'll look down at my script, aka our next question, which also came in via email. I think this is a good one. This one is for you, Shimul. How can people balance expressing how they're feeling about the crisis, which we've heard is important, while also being cognizant of the effects of emotional contagion, specifically for leaders and managers?
Yeah, I thought a lot about this when I was even putting together the briefing, because I think the evidence is sort of mixed in this. I think what I would sort of say is the first thing would be to avoid trying to do too much of this in large groups. There's nothing worse than sort of seeing the Hollywood squares of faces and trying to understand how everybody is feeling. So for a leader, I think one of the best ways to manage this would be to engage in, however hard that is, a lot of one-on-one conversations. So to some extent, by understanding what let's say your follower or your team member is feeling, to have that one-on-one interaction really enables you to, one, adjust how you should be emoting. There might be people who need more positivity, and there might be people who want you to be really real. And by actually understanding where the other person is coming from, it enables you to sort of manage this. One of the hard things about doing the way we tend to do a lot of sort of, it's a leader talking to 12 other people and you're seeing everyone's faces, or 20 or 40 faces online, is it's really difficult, sort of exactly as Alison highlighted. It's hard to really know, where you're looking. A lot of trust comes from eye contact. And when we see those types of pictures online where everybody's face is in a different spot, it's really hard to know where your eye is even moving. And so some of that trust can sort of reduce. And so part of managing these interactions is really engaging in more of a one-on-one setup. I would highlight though that, sort of staying exceptionally positive in an attempt to be sort of manage emotional contagion is possibly, would really ring untrue for anyone you're interacting with. At the end of the day, we want to see that our leaders are fallible too. Like they have, to some extent, they can, they understand where we're coming from. They are experiencing their own difficulties. And so maybe sort of thinking through what the emotions are. And so this becomes really important for the leader to be in touch with themselves too. If I'm feeling exceptional amounts of anxiety, maybe it's not a good time for me to be online right now talking to you, because that's going to leak out in all kinds of ways. But if I'm feeling like I'm struggling and I'm going to be able to talk about the positives and negatives of a situation, I think in some ways that would be the right way for one, that sort of that Goldilocks sort of space to be, where you can express some positivity and some negativity, while sort of balancing also some authenticity during that.
Great, thank you, Shimul. Our next question is I'll pose it to the group, although Matt, I think you touched on this a bit in your presentation, so you may want to take first stab. What are some specific examples of ways organizations are innovating their virtual operations among their teams?
Yeah, I'd love to hear what other people have been hearing as well. A couple of organizations I've seen, they're relying heavily on tools like Trello and some other dashboard type software where it enables everybody to see everything all the time. One of the interesting, silver lining aspects of this is it's not that time has no meaning anymore. It's just that people are a lot more flexible about when they can work. And international organizations where you have people that aren't co-located and they're in different time zones, and it's always been a challenge trying to get them to work at the same time. It's become somewhat easier. You can have meetings at strange times, or you can have incremental work being done. One of the challenges it's always been for groups is trying to find the right time for the entire group to meet when they're on different, chronotypes. Some people don't like work in the morning. Some people don't like the evening. You can have a little more flexibility, especially within subgroups, within larger groups, to find optimal times when they're not working together. So that kind of thing, trying to find ways of turning on its head a little bit and finding some way of actually doing better by using a new tool, a new approach, or thinking a little more broadly about how would we like to work now that we don't have to worry about physically being together all the time.
That's excellent. And as the resident night owl, I will apologize to my team who's been hearing a lot from me after 9 p.m. these days. It's my most productive time, as I'm sure other people are waking up early. Our next question also comes from a researcher. It's how can leadership support the newly hired and those who were brought onto new teams, either just before or right at the start of the pandemic? And I'll open that one up for the group.
I can jump in with a couple of thoughts and then, let everyone else do that too. So I think some of the things stay consistent. I've been reading a lot about orientations that are happening online and how they've moved from being, well, you all get in a room and we just fill out a bunch of paperwork, to actually being a way of codifying cultures and putting them in terms of, really sharing experiences so that the individual who's coming in who might not get the opportunity to walk into a space and learn about the culture by just absorbing it and interacting with different people. So it's really been an opportunity for organizations to say, how can we take what's good about our culture and very strategically demonstrate it and put it in sort of in words or in pictures or in stories or in videos and in that way really start creating more of a culture even for our incoming folks. The other thing that I was recently reading about is this randomized buddy system. So coming in as a new person, one of the things that is sort of best about starting a new job is just getting to know all the people around you, and this is the thing that's missing from these current situations. And so organizations that can do a really good job of saying, okay, sort of today your lunch buddy is so-and-so, or you're having coffee with so-and-so, and this is just a person that you can get to know, and it's 20 minutes and it's an easy conversation, and enable, in some ways it might actually enable these new employees to really create connections that they might not that might have taken them months to actually do because they would have focused on the 4 people they work with on a daily basis. I'll leave it to the rest of the group to talk about some of the other things. These are 2 of the things that I read about that I thought were really, really good ideas.
I can jump in as well if you want. Both for teams or for onboarding, the way I've taught in an online format platform for 6 or 7 years, and so one of the things that's been interesting for me about work from home is recognizing where people are in the learning curve of being comfortable already having to translate things into a virtual environment. I've been doing it for 6 years, but I see people who have never done it at all until 6 weeks ago. And so what I tell people is, you should start by thinking about, if we were face-to-face sitting next to each other, what would I do? And then think about, how do you create a virtual analog for that? Rather than have a set of rules that are virtual only, which is, what am I trying to accomplish in the eyes of my audience when we're face-to-face, and how can I do that? And whether that is how often I meet with somebody, what tools in virtual environments I use. Do I have people breaking out and talking in small groups? How do I vary the media, whatever it is, but start with what you want to accomplish face to face, and then think about, how can I develop the closest proxy for that in the virtual environment? And then specific to, the question about new employees, but I think it's not just new, is upping our frequency of praise. So we know, right, people underpraise, right? Especially high performing individuals. I expect great things from me. I expect great things from you. And your reward for doing great things today is I let you come back tomorrow and do more great things. And people don't work that way. So we see across organizations, even before this, we are not offering enough positive feedback. And that it's simple, costless, and it's highly motivational. And so one easy tweak that people can be making, particularly when they're new, but don't forget about the people who have been there a long time as well, is to look for the opportunities to offer that sincere praise, because it's highly valued. And if we're only doing that, we can sustain people's motivation and energy until a time when people are back face to face.
Quick thought to add there is, I've talked to a few organizations, I've been on calls realizing that almost everybody there was not at their headquarters city. People are getting hired remotely because people are realizing, why not? And so for now, a lot of those people that have been working from home or working remotely, they're very good at the transition. One thing organizations are going to have to think about is, when we do go back to regular work and we have all these remote people that have been used to working remotely, how are we going to integrate them then? And so it's kind of we've been survival mode for a while. At some point, we have to start thinking about, what's our culture going to be, and how do we translate that to people we've hired during this, now that we can interact with them more frequently or in different ways.
That's great. Thank you all for those thoughtful responses. Our next question is one that I think it was Matt who touched on this a bit earlier. How does remote work and negotiation affect introverts and extroverts differently, both for the short term and the long term?
I don't think anybody knows about the long term. But as a very strong introvert, I'm not really minding being home so much. But I have colleagues that are, they really enjoy the interaction, and those people, you don't realize you miss them very often. They're the people that bring a lot of energy to a group, and that they do a lot of social roles. And I think the introvert extrovert misses the fact that the interaction between people and groups, the things they bring to the group that you suddenly don't have, even when you're not looking for it, could be gone. And so I think individually we can suffer in different ways, but as a collective, the groups suffer a lot, because the complementary personality fits we provide within the group are lost. But in terms of some of the other things, like Alison talking about negotiation, I'm not really sure. I don't know much about that. Alison, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think, I'm an introvert as well. And so I joke that extroverts have been spending this time making lists of things they cannot wait to do, and introverts are making lists of things they never want to do again. So a couple things. I mean, basic negotiation. One is not to make assumptions, right? False consensus. We tend to assume that everybody is like us. And I can tell now who the extroverts are, because the extroverts want more meetings and more touch points, and the introverts are finding reasons that they can decline. And so one is not to assume, to ask questions, but also to think about whether it's a formal negotiation or simply how you like to work. Everybody needs to be an advocate for themselves. And so I would say whatever it is that you need as an introvert or an extrovert, you should be putting that out there. That is how we're going to work together during this, is no less a negotiation than any other formal bargaining encounter that we might confront. And so to think about that, here are the things I want, here are the things you want, and to be a strong and effective self-advocate for asking for the things that you need during this time.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you both for those thoughts. I think this is going to be the last question that we have time for, but a question came in on the psychological effects of that long-term disconnect. So, how can managers and teams prepare for what comes ahead, both for the short term of being home during the pandemic, as well as the longer term impact of potentially being home for several months or a year? Hopefully not a year.
And Mackenzie, can you repeat it? It's how do you prepare for like reentry?
Yeah, how do you prepare for basically being home for either this known period of a few months or a much longer period of a year, and work being affected through that?
Yeah, but one of the things I will say, I'll start off and other people can jump in, is human beings are highly adaptable. So I mean, if you think about it, what are we, March 5th? Okay, we're less than 8 weeks into a major lifestyle change. And is everything good for everybody? No. But in a lot of cases, it feels like you've been doing this for a really, really long time. And so I think that transition point, one is, should and will likely happen more gradually than the first transition point we had, right? We went from fully present to fully at home almost overnight. I think what we're going to see is a phased roll in where we are going to be doing that a lot more gradually than we did it. I think that's good. And the second one is we see the resilience of human beings in this period, that people all of a sudden, I now have 3 kids at home. I went from being on an airplane all the time to never being on an airplane at all. And people are adjusting. So that adjustment will happen. But what I would say is I wouldn't think about it as like before, during, and after. What I would think about it as a leader or as a manager is that every day my challenge is the same, right? Is that I'm trying to get up and to make sure that I am informing and motivating the people around me to be able to do their best work. The only thing that's changing in those 3 phases is some of the specifics around how I'm going to do that. So if we keep our eye on the superordinate goal, I think it makes those transitions feel a little bit less dramatic, and to recognize we've already made one major transition for many people, and have done it with with our ability to all survive and be here and get work
done. So I would sort of add just a couple of things. One is just thinking really hard about the goals. So there's just certain sets of goals that I think are somewhat hard to reach, and they're going to be really difficult to do because they require a lot of sort of people co-working, possibly in the same space, or sharing a lot of information, and that's really difficult in some ways to think about attaining. So maybe altering the types of goals or the sets of goals that if something you thought needed to happen next month, maybe that's a goal that gets pushed out, and other goals that are more attainable or doable in this current work setup. I would say that would be one of the really big things. The second one I think would be, kind of related to what has been brought up in different ways, whether it's personality differences or parenting versus non-parents, gender inequities, socioeconomic inequities. I think all of those things need to be, really top of mind for managers now more than ever. So, access to internet came up a lot when we moved online for students, but this access to internet is a problem, for all kinds of different workers, especially if they've returned home to more rural areas because they couldn't, they didn't want to be in bigger cities and exposing themselves to the virus, or just the inequities of like women having to take on more time at home with homeschooling, and what that actually means for promotions and advancement, 6 months down the line, where some other folks who've been likely have more time on their hands and are really bored are actually possibly doing more than they may have been able to do otherwise. And so to be really aware of managing all of these additional sources of inequity, and understanding how they might be affecting individuals' outcomes. I think those would be the 2 things that I would sort of add to this.
That's great. Thank you, Shimul. And in the spirit of not underpraising, I want to thank our panelists once more for sharing those great insights. I know that we are right at time, and unfortunately, we did not get a chance to answer everyone's questions. So if you would like to schedule some time to follow up with any of our experts you've heard from today, you are welcome to reach out to me. You all have my email address, mackenzie_babb@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. I'm looking forward to working with you, and as always, here is a resource in supporting your coverage. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll be doing this again next Tuesday. Mark your calendars. We hope to see you back here again at 11 a.m. Eastern. Until then, take good care and stay healthy.